I will present the second speaker to you, uh, which is from Colombia. He's Colombian national. His name is Isidoro Hasbun. Um, he works for ACTUS. He's the policy advisor, has tremendous knowledge on Colombia, his country, and he will present us in 15 minutes perspectives from Colombia. Isidoro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Domin. Great seeing you. And thank you everyone for joining us in this event. So before going to the first slide, I just wanted to say something that a local partner recently mentioned to us as we are ongoing a strategic planning process for the next years. And it's that ACT is not just an organization, but a deep and strategic idea. It really is, in essence, an idea of promoting Indigenous rights in conservation, in management and ownership of their lands that really stems not only 25 years, but 80 years in the making since the mentors and predecessors of the founders of our organization. So next slide, please. Next slide. Just a brief context. I'm gonna go first a little bit into the geography here, since the presentation originally was going to be about the Guiana Shields, but most people really don't see Colombia as a Guyanese country. It is the least known of the Guianas, but in reality, it's about 20% of the country's territory. Next slide, please. I want to highlight two main features among many in the Guianas of Colombia that are fundamental to understand the region. One is the Rio Negro, the largest left tributary of the Amazon River, the largest blackwater river in the world, and one of the world's 10 largest rivers by average discharge, begins in the Colombian Guyana. And the second is the Chiribiquete Plateau, of which it incorporates the Chiribiquete National Natural Park, one of the cornerstones of the Colombia's national park system, the largest national park by far of Colombia, close to a little bit over 4 million hectares, with average elevations of 900 meters, and forms the western edge of the shield, and conglomerates the Andean Amazon transition region, the Amazon lowlands, and the Orinoco Guiana Shield region. But to better understand the role of Indigenous peoples in protected areas in Colombia, I would like to go to a national scale summary and overview. Next slide, please. So here it's just a brief overview of the Colombian National Protected Area System. It is the set of the Colombian National Protected Area System, as you can see from the different shades and colors. It is a set of protected areas, management strategies, and instruments that contribute to the conservation of the country's conservation objective. It includes all protected areas, public, private, national, regional, and the National Protected Area System of Colombia was established in 1994 after the country signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. About 18 million of the National Protected Area System is on land. That means approximately 15% of the country is considered protected area, whether regional, local, or national in scale. The National Parks Unit manages those protected areas in the system that are national in scale. Those are the national natural parks like Chiribiquete, which I briefly mentioned, fauna and flora sanctuaries, unique natural areas, national natural reserves and parkways. There are 59 of those across the country. Those are the ones in yellow, as you can see. And those are also amount to about 15 million hectares within the 18 million hectares within the national system. So next slide, please. Here, our friends of Parque Nacionales Como Vamos shared a recent report on the status of national parks and had this really informative maps showcasing the indigenous reserves as well as Afro-Colombian community lands that overlap or are located near national parks. There are about 800 indigenous reserves in Colombia with amounting to 32 million hectares, about 30% of the national area, close to. And they are inalienable and imprescriptible, which means that they can't be sold or purchased, or they can't be taken away. They are permanent. They range from very large ones such as Predio Putumayo in the south of Colombia, that is about 6 million hectares, larger than even Chiribiquete National Park, which is the largest tropical national park in the world, to micro reserves of 1 to 2 hectares or less. Of note, indigenous reserves are fundamental for conservation because more than 90% of their lands are forested, meaning that there is little to no deforestation in these areas in Colombia. Recent evidence is showcased. On the Afro-Colombian communities, most are located in the Pacific, and they were established through Law 70 of 1993. These are about 5 to almost 6 million hectares. And this is really a unique aspect of the Colombian legal system. It set a historic precedent around the region. Colombia was the first country to encode the ability for non-indigenous ethnic minorities to receive collective land title, including Afro-descendant communities in the Amazon and Pacific coast. And it created a legal pathway for Afro-Colombian communities to receive collective titles to historically occupied territories in rural river basin areas. So what does this show? It shows that 38 million hectares, that is more than 30%, about a third of the land of Colombia, is within collective title, collective ownership. More than twice the size of protected areas in land categories that are land, not oceanic or maritime. About 18 million of those hectares within the protected area system as well are collective titles. That means that protected area systems overlap with collective ownership, indigenous reserves, and Afro-Colombian communities. 23 national parks overlap with indigenous reserves, with about 40 indigenous reserves, and 8 national parks overlap with Afro-Colombian lands. Next slide. So I'm going to just go through an overview of the work that ACT has done in the last 25 years to promote indigenous-led conservation of protected areas through strengthening of the management of these protected areas, as well as the creation itself of protected areas through the leadership of indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This is the Fragua River in the Andean Amazon and tropical Andes, the most biodiverse region on the planet, the source of the headwaters of the Amazon. In 1996, inspired by the legacy of Richard Evans Schultes, who is one of the mentors of our founders, as Dominique showcased in the earlier presentation. He really saw and encountered the extraordinary world of shamans and sacred plants, began his work in this region. And through a broader view of ethnobotany, the team understood the importance with respect to conservation of integrating and recognizing indigenous knowledge. Less tangible, perhaps, related to spiritual connections, voices from the rainforest, and traditional forms and approaches that are tied with land and territory of indigenous peoples. Under the guidance of the traditional healers and knowledge keepers of the 5 indigenous peoples of Yahe, which are the Ingas, Sionas, Cofán, Coreguaje, and Kamsá, ACT supported the formation of the Union of Indigenous Yahe Healers of the Colombian Amazon Umillac and the Tandachirido Inganokuna Association of the Inga people of Caquetá, who promoted the creation of Indihuasi National Park. Indihuasi means house of the sun, and it was a pioneering protected area that applied this approach of co-management. Next slide, please. I want to go with a brief quote from the Ingas of Caquetá, who supported the creation of this park. It says, "For us, the word park does not cover everything that our territory signifies. It does not reflect our medicine, the spirits, the hunting grounds, the salt licks. We wanted from the beginning to use the word Nuncanchipa Alpa, our land, because park for us is the central square of a community." In other words, although the word conservation does not exist in a language, this word could make sense if it was expressed through Nuncanchipa Alpa. Conservation for non-indigenous people is done in a park. And these are the healers and members of ACT and the Tandachirido Inganokuna Association who led the creation of the park. The declaration was complex. It incorporated new forms of dialogues, and it culminated in the declaration of 72,000 hectares under the category of protected area in 2002. So this declaration was of note for 3 pioneering aspects at that time. It's really a pioneering concept in the early 2000s. The declaration was requested and promoted by an indigenous community for the protection of their ancestral territory. It recognized the importance of conservation beyond biological criteria that integrated cultural aspects within the conservation objectives. And it introduced a new category for the management of protected areas, co-management between National Parks Unit and the Chirido Inganokuna Indigenous Association. With this mandate, the mandate of the traditional healers was fulfilled to protect their ancestral territory, sacred sites, and all the substratum related to the Yahe culture against the threat of the petroleum extraction industry, illicit crops, and the expansion of the agricultural frontier, among other perils. Next slide, please. In 2008, in partnership with the indigenous communities of Putumayo, the Colombian government established another area of the Amazon rainforest as a nationally protected category for the primary purpose of preserving medicinal plants. The new protected area is Orito Ingiandi Medicinal Flora Sanctuary. This 10,000 hectare sanctuary really supports the traditional use of various indigenous peoples, among which we highlight the Cofán, Inga, Siona, Kamsán, Coreguaje peoples. This is the culture of Yahe again, which is one of the strongest shamanic traditions that currently exist on the planet. This is the space in which the indigenous peoples that make up this culture, and especially the Cofán people, can develop their traditions, contributing to the permanence of traditional medicinal systems and the recovery of associated tangible and intangible heritage. Next slide, please. Now, here I want to highlight some of the work connected to the lowland Amazon. In Colombia, now on the formal side of things, there are some management schemes called regímenes especiales de manejo. These are special management regimes, which are agreements for the management of overlapping areas in Colombia that provided by Decree 622 of 1977, when indigenous reserves and national parks overlap. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, about 23 parks overlap with indigenous reserves, but only 9 so far have established regímenes especiales de manejo. And we're working in the Kawinari Indigenous Reserve in the lowland Amazon, articulating our work between the Rio Puré National Park, the Kawinari National Park. Those two amount to 1.5 million hectares. Ati, Aipea, and Pani indigenous community associations related to the protection of indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, like Sandra mentioned in the previous presentation, and the creation of a contingency plan in case of initial contact with these indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight this work, which is fundamental for these regímenes, the promotion of these regímenes especiales de manejo en Kawinari. ACT in 2008, although the work really was a decades-long effort, was able to promote the decree 1232 by the Colombian government, which it was issued for the prevention of harm and protection of the rights of isolated peoples in Colombia. These indigenous peoples are extremely vulnerable to disease and encroachment to their lands. And these are the last peoples that depend 100% on their forests. In Colombia, there's officially recognized one group which can be divided into two, the Yuri Pase. Interestingly enough, these are Ticuna speaking linguistically, and the neighboring communities are Yukuna speaking, meaning that part of the work related to the contingency plan was training Ticuna speaking individuals to be able to, or linguistic family, to be able to support the emergency when these communities come out. Also in the Guiana Shield, ACT along the border with Venezuela supported the creation of a 95,000 hectare Nacuanedoro Indigenous Reserve for the Mapayerri people, which are indigenous peoples in initial contact, meaning that they are just leaving their state of uncontacted state of isolation in the last generations, and they are semi-nomadic. These reserves provides the Mapayerri with the land necessary to continue their semi-nomadic way of life without interference. And it constituted the basis for ACT's drafting of the first set of comprehensive guidelines for the protection of these peoples in Colombia. Next slide, please. Now we're going to the Caribbean region of Colombia. Most people look at this image and do not believe this is in the Caribbean, just less than 100 kilometers away from the Caribbean Sea. But in reality, the tallest mountains in Colombia are located in the Caribbean coast, in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Most of the reserves in these areas, which are owned by the Covi, Wiwa, Arhuaco, and Cancuamo peoples, overlap with the Sierra Nevada National Park, about 300,000 hectare national park. Next slide, please. ACT supported the community in promotion of the Decree 1500 of 2018, which promotes the coherence and promotes the strengthening of the Línea Negra around the Sierra Nevada National Park. As you can see from this map, these are the 3 indigenous reserves in purple, red, and green, and sacred sites are surrounding this Colombian coastal mountain range. Next slide, please. We supported the Covi community in establishing or restoring one of these sacred sites beginning in 2010. In 2013, we supported the Covi in purchasing a sacred site called Habatañihuashcaca. As of today, this site of the Línea Negra It amounts to 250 hectares close. And it really has been an example of restoration of ecosystems led by indigenous peoples close by to the Sierra Nevada National Park. It shows a great example of restoration led by indigenous peoples in the last decade or so, and how quickly ecosystems can be restored if they are given time to recover their ecosystemic features. Next slide, please. My last slide. This is of note because while not being some of them not being in a protected area, ACT has been a leader in the country in the support of indigenous peoples' efforts to title their lands through the resguardos indígenas, like I showcased at the start of the presentation. In the last 10 years, ACT has been fundamental to the titling of close to half of the indigenous reserves in Colombia in terms of land. So it's been really a fundamental actor in the space in the last decade through our partnerships with the Colombian National Land Agency and other entities within the Colombian government. So about 1 million hectares have been titled with indigenous peoples and support by ACT. Of note, some of those are in protected areas, and that really has been because the National Park System has asked for ACT to support the establishment of these reserves due to, in some cases, low capacity by the National Park System to control and protect these ecosystems. So there's kind of an overlap there in some cases. But in others, it does really show that our strategy, while not being formally a protected area, it is really fundamental for the conservation of ecosystems and the restoration of these landscapes. That's it. Thank you, merci. Merci beaucoup. And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Arnaud, for this insights from your country, from French Guiana, from the Parc Amazonien. Even for me, it was really interesting to hear how the park has consulted and how they have changed their attitude towards this issue. Before inviting everybody to the drinks, of course, I would like to invite everybody for asking questions. Questions to Isidoro, to Jessica, to Arnaud. I have a lot of questions. There's a very vast topic has been introduced here. And we have got 4 excellent speakers from 4 different countries with with different settings in each country, and fascinating to learn about that. For the wider community of conservation, including IUCN, which is heading towards 30% of protected areas in 2030. So it's a question of including indigenous territories and learning from everything which has happened in the past. And we all know in the Americas, and especially in Brazil, Colombia, most of the indigenous territories have been installed. So we had a glimpse of information from Colombia, Brazil, Guyana, French Guiana. I want to ask people who have a question now to Jessica, Arnaud, Isidoro, Sandra. Please take the mic or come here and raise your question. Also IUCN, if there are questions towards the speakers.
Okay, is it all right? Yes, it seems to be all right. Okay, thank you very much for all the presentation. This was really interesting. Yes, it's okay. Okay, and Okay, so I have many questions, but I think I will try to be very short because there is a lot of stuff. But first of all, I would have a remark for France because effectively Arnaud said that the constitution prevents recognition for the indigenous people. Maybe the indigenous problematic or thematic would be a good driver for France to change its constitution and go a bit further to respect also the what the president of French Republic said on the aperture of the Congress. It would be very interesting. Maybe it's a bit bold. So I don't know if this is really a question, but just a personal remark. I'm French, by the way. Maybe you noticed because of my English. Sorry for that. Isidoro said that Colombia was a bit far away from the rest of the Guyana Shield and so on. And maybe there is a remark here. As I come from French Guyana also, I think that sometimes we're a bit enclosed in French Guyana and we cannot discuss so much with the rest of the Guyanas. It's a bit a pity, but I would like to know what could reinforce this kind of communication. For instance, maybe we can reinforce, I don't know, standardization of the indigenous culture. I don't know how we can shift this kind of power. Maybe you've got answers for that to indicate how we can maybe redesign the world according to more indigenous standard and spirituality as well. I think I will end here. Thank you.
Isidoro, you want to start?
Yes, certainly. That's a great question by one of the audience members. It's certainly the issue of how do these countries identify themselves? And Colombia has historically identified itself as an Andean nation due to most of its population living in the Andes. I, for example, am from the Caribbean region, and there's multiple regions in Colombia. And it really starts from the country itself rather than something imposed from above. It centers really on how Colombia historically has been a very centralized state, similar to the French state. And it's giving more power to the local citizens in the Guyanese highlands of Colombia, and also educating decision makers. I think most people are not aware that the Guyanese region of Colombia is so vast, similar to the Amazon region of Colombia and their overlap. I think most people are not aware that the Amazon biome in Colombia is almost half of the country. And it's really lack of awareness raising, of really identifying ourselves as a Guyanese country or an Amazonian country, of where we state our priorities as a nation, as a country. And it's, I think, in part, educational, awareness raising with decision makers and seeing the potential there of understanding the country as part of all these different regions, not just one, and increasing communications with other states in the area. That's fundamental. And last but not least, actually fundamental, there's also promoting the exchanges between local communities and indigenous peoples in these areas to understand how they can support each other and promote land rights and conservation of ecosystems. But it's certainly a challenge. Like the audience member mentioned, most people don't know that Colombia has even a Guiana, or it's considered part of the Guyanese highlands. So, thank you.
Thank you, Isidoro. I want to give the floor to Arnaud, as a French citizen and also Deputy Director of French Guiana National Park in La Guyane. Rephrasing a little bit the question, of course, of our friend in the back is coming not from France. You know that a lot of people in the area, in the Amazon and in the Guianas, they know that Suriname and French Guiana is the last one in the South American region not to have recognized indigenous rights and indigenous lands. How do you see that? Is there an evolution? Has President Macron given some attention to this? How do you see that, and the pressure from the other people? Thank you.
Okay. Actually, there were very important social movements in French Guiana in 2017, and there was a commitment. There was a treaty that was signed to seize this big movement, including the transfer of 400,000 hectares to indigenous communities. So now this process is not very far, but anyway, this is some commitment. So something will have to be done. What I would mention about what is complicated with French Guiana, there is a paradox, because there are many footsteps, many attention actually to indigenous people, but this does not go until the process of transferring of land rights. There are some zones in French Guiana which is a kind of recognition of uses, but this is not at all transferring in full property land to indigenous people. So I don't know if a change in the constitution can be made. This is very political, but there is, yes, this paradox of many things being done, but you're just in the middle. You don't go the whole way towards really recognizing rights. There are some small patches, and the regulation of the national park itself is already something special, with special rights given to Amerindian and Maroon people. So from this example, we need to go further. So I think the example of the national park can also be an example that shows that there is no fear. There is nothing to be afraid of. This is possible, and that's what we try to do.
Thank you so much, Arnaud. Please take the floor, or you can come here as well if you want, or just turn the mic maybe. Turn the mic.
Hello, my name is Isabella. I'm from Colombia. So I also work in Colombia with 2 organizations. And I pose this question because it's something that really hits home. And many activists, as well as indigenous leaders in Colombia and in Brazil, are being assassinated for speaking out, for protecting land, for protecting their rights, talking about human rights, defending their rights as indigenous peoples to have autonomy, as well as talking about what is really going on in these really difficult places and the post-conflict in Colombia, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. How do you navigate this, and how do you continue to inspire the next generation to not be fearful and to continue this fight?
So thank you, Isabella. That's certainly a fundamental question to the issue of indigenous rights, rights to land, and also environmental defenders, not only local community members, but several members of the park system have also been threatened, and some of them have been killed as well. Just at the start of 2020, coincidentally, even before COVID-19 began, many members of the national park system of the Colombian Amazon had to leave their posts because of threats to their lives. But may the parks leave, but the indigenous peoples and local communities are there, ever present, and are certainly suffering the most of the impacts from from these pressures stemming from the post-conflict and other issues. You know, the work with youth is fundamental, educating them on their traditions, on the importance of their ecosystems, on the importance of their language, is crucial. That aspect of working with youth, and the ACT has begun working with youth with several actors, such as the Constitutional Court of Colombia, promoting awareness in youth of the importance of nature, of importance of indigenous peoples as well, changing that mindset that not only within the indigenous communities themselves, but as population as a whole. As South America is an example of increasing polarization, that in strengthening inclusion, strengthening lessening discrimination is more and more fundamental. As you know, many of these indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian communities are discriminated against, and there's many views of misconceptions of who they are and what their rights to land implicate. So that's a fundamental aspect, as you mentioned. Ultimately, you know, there's many things that we can do, but you know, supporting communities on the ground, raising awareness of this issue, trying to not be desensitized, I think, is fundamental. As people that work in this issue, we hear about you know, assassination attempts and threats constantly, but it's trying to not be desensitized or demoralized. This work is really intergenerational. It's not just going to shift in 1 year, but as we've seen in Colombia, there can be some positive effects, some positive results ultimately if we continue the work in the long term and not give up, and promote the rights to indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands. Certainly not an easy question. And as you say, Brazil and Colombia are certainly the hot spots in terms of threats and murders to environmental defenders. And it's just, you know, long-term support, understanding that this is not something that's going to end in 2-3 years, but it's really intergenerational, decades of support on the ground.
Thank you, Isidoro, for your reply. We're going over time. I'm sure all of you are thirsty. I still have maybe 5 minutes for last question, if there is one, and then a very short reply before we end up in this session. Yes.
Hello, I am a Brazilian anthropologist. I would like also to add to that question. I was shocked today that I was following the debates on the indigenous people, and then a Palicor lady from the French Guiana, she stood up and she said, I'm here in this Congress invited by COICA, the Cuenca de las Organizaciones Indígenas de la Amazonía, and not by the French government. And I was shocked because as a Brazilian, and believe me, we are in deep conflict and problem at the moment there. But even there, with Bolsonaro in the presidency, the indigenous people keep on marching in Brasilia, but they are recognized as identity and they are minority. And like our Makushi friend who spoke here, I don't know by who she was invited, but the Paluca lady, she was invited by an indigenous organization with all the difficulties to get finance, and not by the French government who is using it as big platform. And I like Macron when he faces Bolsonaro, but I don't like Macron when he doesn't admit that Palicor are an indigenous minority and they deserve to have all the international human rights protection. So that's a question. Why not here in the IUCN make this decision, Minister or dear President?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. I don't think so. It's up to Arnaud to, but if you want to give a comment on this, you're free. It's fine.
I will, well, I don't represent national authorities, huh? But I think there is, I think France has a lot to, and in French Guiana, we have a lot to learn from the neighboring countries in terms of empowerment, in terms of recognition of local communities. So what you mentioned, I know we have also there are some people here invited by WWF and actually other stakeholders, but I think it is not obvious actually it is not obvious in France the link between local communities, indigenous communities, and biodiversity issues. So because French Guiana also is very far, is not well known. So there is all these context actually, but for sure we can do far better in the future. But honestly, we try to. I think Parc Amazonia is, again, it's not a perfect example, but we other I know very well other projects in French Guiana, and it's really scientific. It's really usually a scientific vision. So all that we are discussing now, it is something quite new, actually, and the link that is obvious for all of us here between indigenous communities and the resilience of ecosystems and other ways to protect biodiversity, which are different from setting a regulation or setting a protected area. This is still quite new, so that probably explains the situation.
Thank you, Arnaud, for the last words. I will finalize by saying thank you so much to the speakers. I think we had a wonderful session. Thank you, Isidoro in the US, and thank you, Sandra in Brazil. Thank you, Arnaud, for giving your point of view, and from Parc Amazonien. Thank you, Jessica, for giving the point of view. I really think when I discuss this issue with IUCN Netherlands, I want to thank them as well as the host. When IUCN is heading towards 30% protected areas in 2030, there's also a lot of work to do within the conservation world. Thinking about indigenous issues, how we work with these people, how central land is for them, how many land already protected by indigenous peoples, and what we learned today from 4 different countries. Such a variety of lessons we can take home is really incredible. So with this, I would like to invite all of you to the drink. Just one last comment. ACT is a small, medium-sized NGO. We have a booth here if you want to visit us. And we also have a press conference tomorrow on the importance of the Guiana Shield and the threats facing the Guiana Shield. Thank you so much.